Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, so when we think about the American Revolution, our minds usually go straight to the battlefields, right? We picture the Founding Fathers, the drafting of the Constitution, the whole political upheaval. But what about the American living room? Today's Explainer explores a totally fascinating core thesis, how the very ideals of the American Revolution fundamentally altered the American family structure between 1783 and 1820. We are talking about a real domestic revolution.
All right, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We're going to be looking at how this revolution played out across a few distinct groups. First, a changing American family. Second, white families in coverture. Third, the enslaved family struggle. And finally, Native American matrilineal systems.
Starting off with Section 1, a changing American family. The overarching shift.
You know, when the founders were busy drafting the Declaration of Independence, they probably weren't thinking about how those words would completely rewire how husbands, wives, and children interacted at the dinner table. But that language of liberty and independence, it totally trickled down. For the upper and middle classes, the family actually transitioned away from being this miniature version of the state, where the father was basically the king and the wife was just his helpmate, and it became much more of a cooperative unit. This was the birth of an entirely new dynamic.
Moving on to Section 2. White families in coverture, love, law, and limits.
So, back in the 17th and early 18th centuries, marriages were mostly just economic transactions arranged by dad. The overarching goal was really just to mold women into what they called good wives. But as education expanded and the nation started to settle down, controlling land inheritance became a bit less of an absolute lever for fathers to pull. Young people were heavily influenced by incredibly popular new literature, like Samuel Richardson's runaway hit novel Pamela, and they started demanding companionate marriages. They wanted love, they sought emotional bonds and genuine affection over pure, dry economic utility.
Now, this shift to romance and mutual affection sounds absolutely fantastic, right? But it brings us to a massive, looming question. Did this new, love-based, companionate marriage mean that women actually had real legal rights in the newly independent United States?
So the crucial point we need to understand here is the legal doctrine of coverture. Because despite these awesome emotional gains in their personal relationships, women were still completely legally subordinate. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity literally disappeared into her husband's. Poof. She couldn't own property, she couldn't enter into contracts, she couldn't sue anyone, and she had zero control over her own wages. Honestly, she didn't even have legal control over her own children.
But here's the catch. Society still needed these women to play a crucial role. Enter the concept of Republican motherhood. Influential thinkers like Benjamin Rush and John Adams strongly believed that for this fragile new republic to survive, the next generation had to be fiercely virtuous and patriotic. And who was going to instill those traits? The mothers. So while they were completely restricted legally, European American women gained immense social importance as Republican mothers. Their education was suddenly deemed absolutely essential, transitioning them from simple caretakers to the vital educators of future citizens.
And let's be real, we absolutely cannot overlook the sheer physical toll of running these households. Beyond just raising virtuous citizens, the daily labor required of these women was staggering. Just think about this chore list. Preserving food without refrigeration, making candles, literally from scratch, dairying, brewing the family's beer, sewing clothes by hand, maintaining herb gardens, and caring for livestock. A household back then was basically a highly demanding factory, and the women were running the entire floor.
Now, a huge part of what actually enabled this shift toward focused Republican motherhood was a simple demographic change: the number 4. By the year 1800, birth rates in long-settled areas with smaller farms dropped to an average of 4 children per family. That's down from the 6 or 7 that was typical just a century earlier. This drop meant parents could devote far more time and energy to each child. Families started adopting this Quaker-inspired mindset of nurturing a child's inner light, which was a huge shift from the old, strict Puritan discipline that viewed kids essentially as miniature adults who needed their wills broken.
And this brilliantly illustrates how a stabilizing nation brought some pretty unprecedented material comforts to European American homes. I mean, we go from 17th century wooden houses where whole families might share a single bed and eat from one communal bowl to 18th century permanent brick homes. We start seeing actual privacy, imported books, multiple beds, forks and knives, even luxuries like Madeira wine and sugar. The home truly became a place of comfort rather than just a shelter for bare survival.
Section 3. The enslaved family struggle. Resilience amidst brutality.
We have to pivot now.
because these revolutionary comforts and domestic ideals we just talked about were absolutely denied to a massive portion of the population. We need to turn to the harrowing reality of the enslaved African American family. Enslaved families lived under the incredibly brutal system of chattel slavery, which was reinforced by a devastating legal doctrine from 1662 called Partus Sequitur Ventrum, that translates to, "That which is born follows the womb." This meant a child's status as free or enslaved was determined entirely by the mother, regardless of who the father was. It was a law designed quite specifically to ensure children were born as property, permanently fracturing the family structure from the very moment of birth. Mothers were often forced to carry their babies right into the fields, and children began forced labor as early as age 4.
Yet, in the face of this, the constant looming terror of the auction block and forced separation, enslaved individuals displayed just unbelievable resilience. They fought back by building incredibly robust communal bonds. For instance, they created fictive kin, which meant assigning familial titles like aunt or uncle to elders who weren't blood relatives, but who cared for the kids while the parents were toiling in the fields. Married couples separated by sale would undertake incredibly dangerous, secret night travels just to spend a few hours with each other. And over time, as different tribal identities were forced together, they blended cultures, developing rich new traditions and unique dialects like Gullah in the Low Country.
Because the law completely, violently prohibited enslaved people from legally marrying, they created their own powerful cultural adaptations to declare their devotion to one another. Jumping the broomstick became a vital, deeply symbolic wedding tradition. Couples would hold hands and physically jump over a broomstick to signify their union. It was this profound act of preserving cultural tradition, declaring their commitment, and reclaiming their humanity under a system that stubbornly refused to recognize it.
As we followed the historical timeline into the early 19th century, a major shift occurred. In 1808, the United States officially banned participation in the international slave trade. Now, this introduced a really tragic irony into the lives of enslaved families. Because plantation owners could no longer legally import new enslaved people from Africa, the people already enslaved in the U.S. suddenly became exponentially more valuable as property. Owners started providing small plots of land for vegetables or hiring doctors. They became slightly less likely to separate families, but only because stable families were seen as less likely to revolt. So there was a slight increase in family stability, but it was driven entirely by the cruel economics of preserving valuable property.
Which brings us to our final group in Section 4, Native American matrilineal systems, a different power structure.
Finally, we're transitioning to explore an entirely different approach to family and gender roles, one that was thriving in North America long before the American Revolution was even a thought. Now, what's really fascinating here is how it completely flips the European norm we discussed earlier. While colonial society was strictly patriarchal, passing authority and land down the male line and leaving women legally subordinate, many Native American tribes, like the Iroquois and Cherokee, operated on a matrilineal structure. Lineage, inheritance, and social identity were traced entirely through the mother's line. In these societies, tribal identity and property rights belonged to the women, which granted them a massively significant role in decision-making and property ownership, stuff that European American women simply did not have. Their daily life and division of labor really reflected these communal values. Men generally handled the hunting, while women managed the crucial agriculture, growing those vital staples of corn, squash, and beans. But unlike the European obsession with carving out individual family plots, Native communities practiced communal land ownership. And here is a super interesting historical nuance. While early European explorers judged Native polygamy as some sort of lack of civilization, modern historical studies neutrally explain that women in these tribes often practically valued the practice. Having multiple wives in a household meant sharing the incredibly heavy burden of child-rearing and intensive agricultural labor. It wasn't about subjugation. It was a practical, communal solution to survival.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the big picture. We've seen how the ideals of liberty birthed companionate marriages and Republican motherhood for some, while coverture kept them legally voiceless. We've seen the unbelievable resilience of enslaved families maintaining community bonds in the face of brutal chattel slavery. And we've seen the powerful matrilineal and communal structures of Native American societies. The American family was never just one single thing. It's like a giant, complex puzzle. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. As you look around at modern struggles for equality, parental rights, and companionate love, how are these 200-year-old shifts, these early, uneven domestic revolutions, still echoing in how we define the American family today? Thanks so much for hanging out with me on this deep dive, and keep asking those big questions.